About 2.5 years ago, I had the crazy idea of selling everything I own. I sold my home, my business, my car, my clothing, my artwork, and everything except for about 100 possessions that I can carry with me. This is the bag that I use to travel with, so 2 years on the road and everything fits in that and a carry-on. And I highly recommend getting rid of your stuff. It's one of the most liberating feelings I've ever had. I had the good fortune to grow up in Southeast Asia, in Hong Kong, and we traveled quite a bit as a family as I was growing up, and I think that's probably where I got my love of travel. And ever since I was a little boy looking at back issues of National Geographic magazine, I have always known that this is something that I was going to do eventually one day. So on my 40th birthday, I made a pact with a buddy of mine that when we turned 50, we would cash in our chips and buy a catamaran and sail around the world together. Well, meanwhile, he got married and had a couple of kids, so didn't quite work out like I planned, but in any event, we're still dear, dear friends. He's here tonight, and I decided to go ahead with our pact and do it solo. So what you're about to see are some images from that trip. Grew up in Hong Kong in a packing crate with a roommate on a steady diet of hot dogs. But eventually I got out of that box, and through a very circuitous set of circumstances, which included working as a pizza delivery guy and a television news reporter and a radio disc jockey and a camera salesman and a guy who worked at night at a funeral home picking up dead bodies. Those are all actual jobs that I've had. And eventually wound up here in Austin, and about 25 years ago, I opened a full-service photography studio, and we worked with clients such as Dr. Pepper and Dell and 3M and Intel and Sony. And I did that for the better part of 3 decades, about 25 years, and thoroughly enjoyed it, and was so fortunate to get to make a living at doing something that I love. But in keeping with that promise that I had made to myself as a little kid, and then had remade with my buddy, I invested all my money on my 40th birthday there where you see buy. And then on my 50th birthday, I sold it here. So you can see that turned out to be a really brilliant investment strategy. This photograph was taken by my dear friend Matthew Lemke. This is to obviously portray a guy who has sold everything he owns and is down to just the contents of that bag back there in the corner. So here I am sitting in my empty living room. So off I went on my journey, and my mission was to circumnavigate the globe, to travel for 3 years, and to embrace randomness whenever I encountered it, and to savor all of the wacky adventures that life seems to serve up in heaping helpings. So right now I am about 2/3 of the way into that 3-year journey. I've gone around the world 1 time. I've been in 23 countries in the last 24 months, and I came back to Austin to recharge my friendship batteries before taking off again. So probably be leaving sometime in January to continue the Rompin, Stompin, Circus of Love extended world tour. Next destination will be the Caribbean. Let's see some pictures, why don't we? started my trip, I had been doing something for the better part of 30 years that I had become something of an expert at. I'm not saying that I had mastered photography by any means, but my point is that when I left my studio behind, and with it, all of my professional lighting equipment, my professional camera gear, my assistants, my hair and makeup person, my wardrobe person, I became a complete neophyte again. I had to learn to see the light and to shoot with just the light that was available to me. And frankly, it was a really daunting prospect. You would think that somebody who had made their living doing photography for all that time would be, you know, overjoyed at that idea, but it was really quite daunting to me. And of course, the Buddhists have this notion of the beginner's mind. In the mind of the expert, there are very few possibilities, and in the mind of the beginner, there are many. So that's the mindset that I had when I began the trip. And the words of the German philosopher Goethe are, whatever you can do or dream you can do, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Begin it now.
John was very naughty, and he's being punished by bilging out the dinghy. Say hi, John. John's like, I'll do anything.
So this is what a novice looks like. The skipper of this boat, Mike Landry, is here tonight, and he will tell you that in my effort to be of assistance to him when we were sailing in Tonga, I pulled the dinghy up beside the catamaran, and it promptly filled with water from the exhaust. So I was exiled to the dinghy to bail it out. Anyway, back to the notion of being a neophyte. I want to invite each of you, as you're watching and listening, watching the images and listening to the words of myself and the others that I've recorded, to not just take away from this pretty pictures and envy that you're not traveling the world. I'm hoping that I can give you something of more substance than that. I hope to take you on a journey that is a much more intricate and internal and interesting journey than that.
If you follow your passion, you put yourself on a kind of track that has been there all the while, waiting for you. And the life that you ought to be living is the one you are living. Wherever you are, if you are following your passion, you are enjoying that refreshment, that life within you all the time.
I've come to believe that I have an internal compass, and I think all of us have this same instrument that will always point to true north. And the trick is to remove the obstacles to being able to accurately read that internal compass that each of us has. One way to do that, I have found, is to say yes to life. I have found that when I say yes, life just opens up into an infinite number of unimaginable possibilities. It creates a fork in the road, and then another fork, and before you know it, this has just branched out into this infinite network of possibilities. And saying yes is a scary place to be. We don't know what the future holds, and we don't know where we're going to wind up. But this is where I wound up in Fiji as a result of saying yes. I met a guy at breakfast one morning at a hostel that I had chosen completely at random, and we struck up a conversation, and I asked him what he was doing in Fiji, and he told me that he was there doing marine conservation. And he asked me the same question. I told him that I was a photographer, that I was just, traveling around the world and was about a month into my trip. And he said, well, you don't happen to have an underwater camera, do you? And I said, well, I certainly do, and I've got an underwater housing and an underwater flash. And he said, well, how soon do you think you could come with me to this private island that's owned by the grandson of the king of Fiji? And I would like to treat you to 3 weeks of unlimited diving in pristine waters where no human being has gone before, as well as these very upscale accommodations and free room and board. So I said, how soon can we leave? Pardon me. So that's one of the possibilities that happens when you say yes. These are some of the images from that stay in Fiji. This guy up here in the upper right corner, the remora, that's the fish that swims around cleaning sharks. That guy tried to stick to the inside of my thigh for an entire 30 minutes underwater. That is not the kind of togetherness that I... So I spent 3 weeks on this it was like, imagine Gilligan's Island, except with, running water. Cold running water, but it was really just an amazing place, and I was able to take some of these portraits of some of the residents there of that island. Wonderful, wonderful, sweet people, and got to learn all about marine biology. And almost every night there was just a spectacular sunset. This was the fellow that drove the dive boat. And at this point in my trip, about 6 weeks into my trip, the chatter was just going nonstop in my brain. I don't know how many of you have spent very much time alone, and by alone I mean really alone. That little monkey brain is just going nonstop. So at this point, I was kind of going crazy and feeling kind of scared.
Security is mostly a superstition. It does not exist in nature, nor do the children of men as a whole experience it. Avoiding danger is no safer in the long run than outright exposure. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing.
Pretty poignant words coming from somebody who couldn't see or hear. Next stop was the beautiful, beautiful South Island of New Zealand. People often ask me, the first question they ask me is, why did you do it? The second question is, what kind of camera do you use? And the third question is, what was your favorite place? And with no disrespect to any residents of any other countries, I would have to say that in terms of just pure natural beauty per square inch, the South Island of New Zealand is incomparable. So back to this notion of saying yes. There are plenty of excuses that we can come up with that are really just a smokescreen for fear. I'm too busy. I've got kids in school. I've got a job. I've got responsibilities. I'm too tired. I don't have enough time. There's not enough money. Insert your excuse here. And we've all done it, myself included. I still do it. But we know what saying no feels like. We know what that gets us. It gets us a place that's very constricted and confined. We know what the outcome is going to be. Whereas saying yes opens up all kinds of possibilities. Incidentally, this image was taken with my iPhone, and I had to learn what a flat white is. That's the name of that latte, as they call it in New Zealand. I want my images to be graphically very simple. I think this is part of my advertising background because it's hard to turn off that little voice that says, okay, you got to leave room for a headline, and this is going to be a double-page spread, so don't put anything in the middle. And so it's been kind of tricky trying to turn that off. But I also want my images to convey a sense of peace and tranquility. I want them to be very accessible to the viewer. And I like to focus on tiny little details because I find that when I'm traveling, it helps to slow me down. It helps me to really appreciate each place where I am. And it keeps me in the moment. I found that I was kind of chastising myself for taking so many photographs, and I wondered to myself, was I using that as an excuse to actually be in the moment? Was I documenting the moment rather than living the moment? And what I eventually decided was that as a photographer, this is the way I see the world. This, looking through the camera, is how I look at things. So after a while, I was able to turn off that critical voice, and I would invite you to do the same. As somebody said to me once, get rid of all the critical voices in the cheap seats and replace them with a balcony full of your biggest fans. So in terms of trying to regain my sensitivity to natural light, I think I said this to skipper Mike Landry on the boat in Tonga. I was amazed at his ability to read the wind, and even the most subtle puff of air, he could gauge the way that was filling the sails or causing them to luff. And I made the analogy with him at the time that was what I was trying to regain, was that same sensitivity to light. So this image, which to me kind of looks fake, I saw this cloud moving over the landscape with this hole that was beginning to develop. And so the sun is coming through that hole and creating a spotlight on that tree. And everything else is covered in shadow by the cloud. Some more images of just how spectacularly beautiful New Zealand is. And again, images of tiny details to help me to stay focused, stay in the moment, and to slow down. Another thing that I try to do in my photography on this trip is to show the commonality of things all over the world by photographing mundane objects, in this case, colorful clothespins, but to show how similar people's activities are anywhere you go on the planet. The kind of utensils that they use, the kind of brooms that they use to sweep out their houses, bicycles. At the end of this presentation, you're going to think I've got some sort of broom and bicycle fetish. Wash basins, people playing chess. These things are common the world over. And so I try to capture that in my imagery, just as a way of showing how there's a thread that ties us all together. I love this image on the left of some, I guess it's moss growing on a rusted tractor. To me, it almost looks like a map. And that's a final image there of New Zealand, Lake Tekapo.